Hello, folks. Welcome to another weekly roundup with the gang here at Socialist Telly. Today we have myself, Steve Walker, Bonnie Craven. How are you doing, guys?
I'm just getting over a bad cold, so if I look even more kind of snuffly and sore-nosed than usual, that's why.
You benefit from good lighting, mate. That's what it is. That's what we keep telling you.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So, let's kick off with probably the biggest story that we have had to cover this week, because it all sort of happened just after we did our last week's weekly roundup, and that's the business on Clapham Common. Saturday night, we saw appalling scenes of violence on Clapham Common. What was supposed to be a respectful vigil for a young woman murdered by a police officer turned into a sickening show of excessive force against a crowd consisting mostly of women by the police. And if the police wanted to show the public that the Sarah Everard case was the exception, they failed utterly in scenes that will long be remembered. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't a scene of a revolution. It wasn't an uprising. It was just a peaceful vigil. It was intended to be an event of solemn silence and remembrance. And in the week where International Women's Day had been celebrated, it was a chance to highlight violence against women and how things have got to change. But instead, it's going to be remembered for the police pinning women to the floor, grabbing and pushing and throwing punches even. And it didn't have to be this way. Other vigils were observed as they should have been, with the police looking respectfully on. So what happened at Clapham Common was absolutely obscene. However, scenes like this potentially could be now legalised. I've always had a healthy respect for the law. They need to have order. However, for a law to be a just law, there must be a moral argument for it. And in this case, there isn't one that exists. It's utterly immoral, taking advantage of Brexit, essentially, to begin a bonfire of civil rights. 10 years in prison for protesting or living on the road, as the GRT communities do. Don't annoy your neighbour with noise, or you could be going away for a very long time. This law is wrong if it ever comes to pass. Many people speak proudly of their parents or grandparents who opposed fascism during World War II. Well, 359 MPs just voted for a bill which effectively stamps on that. They didn't fight and die for the country to be taken over by fascists who can pass fascist legislation, yet this is what we face with this bill, should it go through. Now, we've now heard that this legislation is being delayed. The Tories have evidently been taken aback that we won't allow them to just walk all over our civil rights, God forbid. But any time a Tory MP mentions the word democracy from now on, they need to be reminded that they voted against it. What did you make of the scenes last Saturday, guys, and what's happened since?
Well, they were pretty shocking. It shows why we can't afford to have a Tory government, because the Tories will always use the police as a political weapon in a way that is completely contrary to the idea of policing by consent. We saw just a few days before the scenes in Clapham Common, a football fans in a procession because their club had won something, and the police were standing by the roadside, making way for them, giving them an escort, seeing them through the through the whole process, even with the vans going in front of them to make sure that they had a clear road ahead. And then we get to a peaceful vigil on Clapham Common, everybody wearing masks, which the football fans hadn't been. And the police decided to go wading in and be dragging people across with that photo, which has already become iconic in terms of the woman with the red hair being handcuffed behind her back and dragged off by the police. It was, well, what can you say? I mean, the tragedy and the thing that most appalled me out of the consequences of that really was the fact that it was good that Labour eventually did a U-turn after still planning to whip MPs to abstain on the thing until I think the Monday morning. But finally we saw a little bit of a decision to oppose from Keir Starmer. But in terms of until that point, until Clapham Common, he'd been quite happy to just wave that legislation through the House, could tell his MPs to abstain, stand aside, say nothing about it. And, the impact of being put in prison for 10 years for causing an annoyance, the, obvious and really quite fascist clampdown on the right to protest. And, the horrific impact of this, which I covered this week with on Gypsy Roma traveller people. All of that, was by the by for Keith. He was quite happy to just stand aside and let that go through until Clapham Common, and the government's now buckled under the pressure and have delayed this bill. Whether they'll bring it back when the public outroar dies down a little bit remains to be seen. But it wasn't only the government that did a U-turn because of public outrage; it was Keir Starmer too. And yet we're seeing Labour start to tentatively claim credit for the fact that the government's back down now, when really it was the public that got that done. That's a bit of a pattern, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw last weekend was absolutely horrific. Seeing women gathering for a peaceful vigil being brutalised by the police. And as you said, Steve, in contrast with the treatment of the football fans in the same week, it makes me wonder if it was deliberately set to intimidate those women, not least because they were remembering a woman who had been, it would seem, murdered by one of their own ranks. So, it was highly significant. And I think that the public outrage at the way that those women were treated has lifted the lid a little bit on the amount of public outrage at the notion that we should be denied our, human right to protest and to gather peaceably. So yeah, that was really quite horrendous. But the idea that Keir Starmer was asking our MPs to abstain on that when we're supposed to be a socialist democratic party, it just exposes the extent of control from the top of our party and their refusal to listen to the grassroots members, because I would struggle to find any Labour Party members that thought it was a good idea to clamp down on protest.
No, it was. I mean, it's the sad thing is, it took this event to happen for Keir Starmer to even look at actually opposing this. And let's not forget, the original plan was for him to whip the party to abstain yet again on an issue of having your democratic say. This has been a pattern of his leadership up till now. And for this to go through, I mean, you're absolutely looking at the return of some of the worst examples of police brutality that we've seen in our recent history. I mean, when you think of police brutality, we on the left automatically think of Orgreave, for example, and the brutality that was shown there. Steve mentioned the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community, and I can recall as a Levellers fan, they wrote a song called Battle of the Beanfield, and this was about a police attack on Gypsies, Romas, Travellers, New Age Travellers, I believe it was at the time, in the mid-'80s, who were gathering at Stonehenge. And that, again, was another brutal, violent attack by the police on people who just want to live their lives how they choose to live them. And this is essentially taking the way of life for people to, how people choose they want to live their lives away from them. And, I spoke to my wife, actually, about this when it all came out and what happened on how the effect this would have on the GRT community. And she said, well, what are they going to do if they ban their way of life then? Are they going to give them all houses? I mean, for a start, okay, fair enough. A lot of the GRT community would not want a house, for example, because it goes against their way of life. But for argument's sake, if they were all to be housed, where are these houses to start with anyway? We already have a housing crisis. There's just no way this is any way practical or sensible. This is an offensive, anti-democratic, fascist attack.
Well, the other side of that, Damo, as well, is that they're planning to treat GRT people as as trespassers if they camp somewhere that isn't an official encampment. But as Mikey, who was on my the special show I did on it earlier this week, he was making clear that the number of sites is totally inadequate, and when they exist, they can have a waiting list of up to a year to get on them. So you're essentially making it impossible for people not to trespass, and then confiscating the stuff and putting them in prison for doing the trespass. I think one of the interesting things that came up in response to that program as well was people were harking back to an earlier age when the police were allowed to lock you up for being annoying, and I saw a couple of people saying that their great granddad or whatever had been locked up in Ireland when Ireland was was still part of the UK before its independence, and saying that their great granddad got locked up as a kid for speaking Irish Gaelic in the street, because as far as the police were concerned, that was out of line and they were trying to clamp down on that. And we've seen that attitude still propagated this week with Jacob Rees-Mogg, the MP for the 17th century or whatever they call it, who was referring to Welsh and to Irish as foreign languages, when in fact those are the original, kind of certainly much earlier languages in this country than English, which was an immigrant language. And as far as he was concerned, that was it. But we still see Tory councillors and other people in Wales, for example, pouring scorn on the Welsh language and trying to say that it shouldn't form part of broadcasting and form part of education, etc. So that attitude of just wanting to homogenize everybody to be like the English is tragically still a major factor of conservative thinking. And who would bet against it that if you're here and you speak in a language that some policeman takes exception to, you could find yourself banged up.
Absolutely. I mean, the clampdown on the right to protest, the brutalisation of women, the police brutalising disabled people, and the legislation against the GRT community, it has very, very uncomfortable undertones for us on the left that are aware of working class histories. You look at 100 years ago when women were having to put an awful lot of pressure to obtain the vote. They tried it through peaceful means, and when they were thwarted, the level of activity and the actions got more extreme. In the last week, we've heard the right to protest as a sort of release valve for people who are upset or concerned or wanting to express resistance to legislation that's being handed down to them. And we had 100 years ago, we had the awful Cat and Mouse Act, where suffragettes were arrested, thrown into prison, went on hunger strike, and when they got just too sick, they were released so they'd go outside and eat food, and then the police would round them up again afterwards. And obviously you had force feeding of women and so on. And we've had in the last couple of years disabled people who are protesting peacefully. We've had Paula Peters on Socialist Telly in the last week as well, talking about people in wheelchairs being pushed out of the way and tipped out of their wheelchairs by police and so on. We're supposed to be being policed by consent. And the fact that we've got a government that's legislating for the police to be able to act as agents of the state or a home army, it's really worrying. And so and I think that the reaction, I think the general public have seen what road they're taking us down to, and having attended quite a lot of meetings in this last week talking about what we do next, I think that the government have very wisely made a U-turn and decided to postpone this legislation, because despite the fear of coronavirus and the reasons why it's difficult to gather and protest in order to maintain social distancing, which must happen and was happening at Clapham Common last week, I think we would have seen an awful lot of anger on the streets, and they really don't need to take us down that road. It's a scary road to go down.
Yeah.
And, there are very few practical limits in terms of what the authorities won't do if they take exception to a protest. So it hasn't had a lot of publicity, and I've received the footage and hopefully be publishing that shortly. But there was a bunch of the 1950s women who have lost out on a big part of their pension entitlement by the government deciding to arbitrarily change the pension dates for them. And they put on a protest outside the DWP headquarters in London and were essentially kettled by the police. And it's quite shocking, because the police, if the excuse for not wanting demonstrations at the moment is that it's got to be safe and, COVID safe and social distance and all the other stuff, the police were going wading in, getting in the faces of these, by now pensioner women, essentially, although a lot of them haven't qualified for the pension because the goalposts moved. But, the older women mounting a peaceful protest and then ended up with an unmasked police officer right in their face, kettling them up against the wall or the door of the building and not giving them any room to get away, and squeezing right in on them to try and hamper their protest. And, if the police will go for somebody who's, more likely to be somebody's granny than a threat, then, it shows how dangerous that legislation is, really.
And we've also seen, historically, another group that get attacked by fascist states are the trade unionists. And in the last week, we saw trade unionists on a peaceful picket line in Scotland being arrested for daring to protest against unfair terms and conditions that were being imposed upon them. So let's have a quick look. Who is being closely monitored and examined at the moment? We've got women, we've got disabled people, we've got GRT people, we've got trade unionists. It's painting a picture reminiscent of less than 100 years ago, and it is worrying. We do need to, as a labour movement, we need to be pushing back against that in every way we have available to us.
Yeah, but equally, the public needs to start to stand up and wake up to this more and more, and look at these things. If you just tied these things together neatly there, Bonnie, they need to look at this and think, hang on a minute, they've come for the GRT, they've come for the disabled, they've come for women, they've come for the trade unionists. Who are they going to come for next? Because there's always going to be someone else they're going to come for, and there'll be somebody else's rights to go. And the right to protest is an enshrined civil right. You have to be able to have your voice heard, to have your say, to voice your displeasure. You can do it in a peaceful way, but this is, if this does progress, it's been delayed. It hasn't been canned as such at the moment. I think they've been taken aback slightly by just how much the British people have kicked out at this. And great, because we're a nation known around the world for sitting on our hands and just letting our government do stuff to us and impose stuff. And you have to draw a line, because they're going to keep taking and taking and taking until people make a stand. It's never going to be enough. How many more of your rights are going to go now? We're living in quite dangerous, quite frightening times. And anybody in the police force, quite frankly, really needs to think about what brought them into the police force, and what anybody that wants to go into the police force, why do you want to go into the police force? What is it that inspires you about it? Because if you're going to be stood on a picket line arresting people, waspy women or disabled activists or trade unionists who are just fighting for a fair wage, for a fair day's work, you've got to ask yourself, are you in the right business? Are you doing this for the right reasons? Because you're state-sponsored thugs otherwise.
Let's move on and chat a little bit about Scotland. We were talking just now about disrespect to non-English nations in the UK and elsewhere, but we've seen some goings on in Scotland this week. I find it extremely interesting that Keith is calling for the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon after she gave evidence to a committee of the Scottish Parliament to do with the stuff around Alex Salmond. As far as I'm aware, nothing was proven against Nicola Sturgeon, and yet Keir is calling for her resignation. Whereas when we've had a proven, unlawful verdict on the action of Matt Hancock, Starmer didn't think that it was appropriate to call for his resignation. I mean, what does that say? That he'll go for the throat of an SNP politician,
Woman.
Yeah, woman. And yet let a Tory man off the hook.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, you raise the Matt Hancock case against him, but I would actually say that we ought to be calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister, because he's presided over 130,000 plus deaths that were avoidable in this country through his own inactions and appalling decisions, which have incidentally grossly benefited his friends and cronies. That's where we need to be calling for a resignation, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, he never has asked for the resignation of any Tory, not that I can recall. Every single one of them, he's said, now is not the time. I don't want to see them resign. And when it came out with Matt Hancock, it was just, oh my God, why? The guy is, the contracts, the money, he's just handed over to donors and mates and pest control companies and horse racing circles and all the rest of it, not people who are in the trade to provide the services and the products that are needed. And it is absolutely cynical. Labour in Scotland is on its backside. It's been a Blairite rump for a long, long time, Scottish Labour. Richard Leonard, to his credit, he tried his damnedest with it, but in the end they came for him, and they've now elected an Ass Sarwar, who's far more Starmer's sort of guy. And I can't help but think this attack on Sturgeon is a cynical attempt to try and restore Labour's fortunes in Scotland by trying to take some of the SNP vote back. I think it will utterly fail. They've been taking the Michael out of Starmer in Scotland this week, the Scotsman publishing a photograph of him with the sign look left behind him. And Starmer, in all of his switched on woke glory, retweeted it thinking they were somehow bigging him up when actually they were just frankly taking the piss out of him.
Yes. Well, I've got that here. Let's have a look. So we saw, Keir Starmer decide that he was going to go against tax rises at the recent budget and would, stand against that and stand with big business and the very wealthiest who were facing potentially higher taxes, and against the public, because the public was massively in favour of increasing taxes on very rich people and on big business, with even almost, I think it's 1% less than 2/3 of Tory voters at the last general election thinking that raising taxes was a good idea, and more than that among other voters. And Keir Starmer decided that, he was going to stand against the voter and stand with big business and the very wealthy. And then when it comes to Scotland, and this is a Starmer, this is an Anna Sarwar comment, but, he's very much in line with Starmer on this, and no doubt wouldn't be making this statement if it hadn't been pre-approved by Westminster interfering in Scottish politics again. At this election, we'll be prioritising unity over division. After everything we've been through across the entire UK, we can't return to the old arguments. So with a majority now of Scottish people, according to the latest polling, in favour of having Scotland be independent, their supposed idea for getting back more votes and getting more Scottish MSPs is to have a dig at the idea of independence. And it's really remarkable how, the only time that Starmer's ever willing to oppose normally is when it's opposing the public and siding with the establishment and with the big business that is funding far too much of politics at the moment. And that's that's where we are in Scotland just at the minute, and it seems a very sad state of affairs and very hard to believe that it's not going to be a car crash this in a couple of months when it comes up.
So there's a couple of points I'd like to pick up on there, Steve, if I may. The first one is it appropriate for a Westminster politician to decide what ought to be happening in Scottish politics? Don't think so, number one. Number two, when you have a political party that is run by the people at the top, the leader, the deputy leader, the general secretary, and that has disallowed a proper voting conference last year, and then wouldn't even allow us to discuss a recall of conference because the membership are unhappy about the direction that the party is moving towards. What you get is decision and policy made by policy wonks or advisors, the Mandelsons of this world, and there will absolutely be a massive disconnect between what the hierarchy of the party think we want and what we're trying to tell them that we need. And until they meet somewhere in the middle, we are just going to be sent back down on the neoliberal path that all politicians, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, pretty much have been going down for the last 40 to 50 years.
Yeah, there's no issue with Starmer, for example, to go up and offer support to what Scottish Labour are actually going to try and say, are going to try and do. But the decisions that affect Scotland need to come from Scotland. As Bonnie said, if Westminster starts saying, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, it just gets people's backs up and it stokes that independence argument up even more. Whether you're for it or against it, whatever's, powers have been devolved towards Scotland for years now. They've been making increasingly more decisions in their own right to try and take some of that back, which is essentially what this kind of language, this kind of discourse sounds like. It's, even if that's not the intention, if that's how it comes across, then Labour are in for an almighty hiding in Scotland beyond whatever has happened to them so far. They are a rump of the party that they once were, and the lessons from that are not being learned.
It's not just Scottish democracy that Keir and co seem to have contempt for. We've seen in Bristol this week the resignation of an entire branch executive of the party in protest at the hijacking of their democratic selections by the regional office there and having candidates. Well, they had a mayoral candidate thrust on them, or a shortlist of right-wing mayoral candidates thrust on them with no left-winger for them to choose from. And then we saw that with the council selections, the regional office took that over, but hasn't actually selected anybody yet. So they not only have been deprived of their choice, but they haven't even got any candidates in place as of when the article on that went out this week. At least it may have changed now. So, we've seen the situation in Streatham, where we saw this at the Streatham CLP meeting hijacked again by the London regional office in this case, and big problems that were eventually resolved successfully in most cases, with the way that the party handled the voting on that, and the left managed to rally and win back a good number of the positions there. But the big one, I guess, this week is the fact that the then incumbent MP for Hartlepool resigned with immediate effect, without any explanation as to why he was resigning. And the Labour Party, with the collusion of Keir Starmer's office, as became clear from a leaked email, decided that they were going to have rather than give members a choice, they were going to have what they call a shortlist of one. It was going to be an all-male shortlist in this instance, with one particular gentleman on it, and deprive members in Hartlepool of any say as to who was going to represent them. And the party then, in its infinite wisdom and sensitivity to local issues, has decided to put an ultra-Remainer candidate in for the party in that seat. And, in a seat that was, I think, 69.7 or something percent leave at the referendum, which is just, you've got again, are they trying to lose? Do they not want to win? But, it's hard to see any respect for members in the way that process has been done.
No. Go on, Bonnie.
Thanks, Damo. I was just going to say, I've been through a selection process myself, and it is really tough going. You've got a lot of work to do to get selected. And if this candidate has managed to bypass that, that's all well and good. But the bottom line is, even if the party had a preferred candidate that they wanted to impose on the CLP, to me, shows a massive lack of confidence in their own choice if they thought they had to fix it and not give the choice to the constituency Labour Party members in the relevant seat.
Yeah, I'm not sure that any left-wingers would have gone for it anyway, because I think that it's not looking promising there in a seat like that to for Labour, when if the anti-Labour pro-Brexit vote in 2019 had been combined, then Labour would have lost that seat by a distance. It was because the Brexit Party didn't stand down in that one and split the vote with the Conservatives that Mike Hill, who's now gone, managed to scrape through with a vote that wouldn't have been that much more than half of the other guys combined. So I'm not sure anybody would have done, because I think people want Keir Starmer to drink from his own poisoned chalice there and find out just how popular or otherwise his policy positions are. But even so, even if it's only a choice between one right winger and another, members should be getting some kind of choice among candidates who want to go for it. Interesting bit of there was an interesting conversation on Twitter this week where, in fact, I think it was just yesterday, where Thelma Walker, no relation to me, who was a former MP who quit the party altogether in protest at the way that Keir Starmer was behaving, was making what might not have been an entirely tongue-in-cheek comment to a Labour I think still current Labour member, who was asking her about whether she had any intentions on standing in Hartlepool for a Northern Independence Party, and she didn't say no. Let's put it that way. She said that she was exploring and finding out a bit more about that option, which could be interesting. If you get somebody down to earth and working class standing in a place like Hartlepool, they could just get a shot.
A lot of people were asking her about that, and she was very fond of using the old wink emoji on Twitter, refusing to confirm or deny what her feelings were. But this whole selection has stunk from start to finish, really, with Mike Hill going. I think it was less than a day, was it, for people to come forwards, and then a matter of days later they were going to have a long list, and then the long list consisted of just one candidate, and it just happened to be the person that Starmer was rather fond to get on. And it does seem that democracy has been completely bypassed here. I mean, not many people are under the illusion anymore that Keir Starmer is much of a socialist, but the other word on the back of our membership cards is Democrat, and that seems to have been conveniently been forgotten with this process as well. It's very, very fishy the way this has gone on.
Yes, and I'll just point out here that none of us, as far as I can tell, are advocating people to vote for any other party than the Labour Party. We're not going to make it that easy for Labour to kick us out. We've seen a few moves in that area, but it will be interesting to see how the current Labour regime performs in Hartlepool and what kind of verdict is returned by the local people there on the way that Keir Starmer has led the party since he made a big deal out of putting it under new management.
Yeah, I mean, out of interest, I just wanted to say, backing up, obviously, we will always advocate that people vote Labour. In London, we've seen the other two major parties totally screw up with their selection of candidates for London mayor. Sadiq is the sitting mayor for London, and there was a ballot a while back if we wanted to go on with Sadiq or have an open selection, which is a whole other argument. And obviously the elections have been postponed a year because of the coronavirus pandemic. But what we've seen is the Tories this week decide that they were going to withdraw all lines of credit from the Conservative candidate for mayor. And we've seen the Lib Dems are now on their third candidate for mayor since this process started. So, these selection processes generally work better when the members who are going to be the ones knocking on doors, making the phone calls and delivering them and paying for the leaflets are involved in the process.
Yeah, I guess it's not much of an advert for Labour Party politics that we might scrape through in London because the other parties bollocked it up even worse than we did. I mean, that's just about the state of UK politics at the minute, isn't it?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually add, though, that since the constituency of Hartlepool was formed, Labour has always held it. They've never lost it. And if that's going to happen now, it's going to be an indictment on the way that not only the selection process has been taken, but as we've seen in Bristol as well, how the party is actually treating its membership. If members don't feel that they're part of the democratic process anymore, that they pay dues into, that they volunteer their time and effort into, then, when the time comes that the party calls on them to, we want you to go out there and leaflet, we want you to go out there and door knock. You've had a branch executive completely resign because they don't like the direction that things are taking now. There's going to be an awful lot of members in Hartlepool who are not going to be happy about how this has taken place. It's the same story we have seen, as you said at the start of this segment. It's being played out across the country. Members are being disenfranchised, and if that carries on, the party shouldn't be surprised when more and more members are going to choose to stand by and sit on their hands and not give their time and effort. And Labour rely on that. We haven't got big money donors anymore to pay out for massive adverts and big campaigns. It's boots on the ground. It always has been. That's the way it should be for a working class party, which we purport to still be.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. I mean, that's my local neck of the woods, up there in the northeast where I come from originally, and people in Hartlepool have always returned a Labour MP so far. But Hartlepool is just across the river from Redcar, and Redcar is just borders on the Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland constituency, and both of those returned non-Labour MPs at the Tory MPs at the most recent general election. So if people in that neck of the woods feel like they're taken for granted, like most people anywhere, if the party treats them with contempt and doesn't put the right candidates forward, doesn't show look like they're interested in their views and their opinions on stuff, then you're going to end up with a kickback, and you can lose. So I think it's worrying time for Labour in Hartlepool, and it will be interesting to see if that goes badly, like a lot of people are predicting. Will the right choose to pull the trigger on their move that they've been preparing for some time now on Keir Starmer and try to lever him out so they can get somebody else in? It would be hard to argue that that his position was tenable if they managed to lose someone like Hartlepool after choosing to limit members to only having one candidate and choosing that candidate to be an arch Remainer who's not from there to begin with.
Well, he's going to blame somebody else if that is what comes to that.
Well, he'll blame Jeremy Corbyn, no doubt.
It'll be Corbyn's fault, of course, but
Yes.
he'll blame this NIP party, the Northern Independence Party. Nippers is awfully tempting to call them nippers. I don't think anybody's actually coined that phrase yet. Or he'll blame the Tories for having that vaccine bounce, which he's this is the excuse he's using at the moment for his poor polling of late. The trouble is his polling decline started about 2 months before the vaccine came in, when he first suspended Jeremy Corbyn. He has, caused a lot of bad faith, bad blood in taking the action he did after that investigation happened. I truly think that if Labour does lose Hartlepool, it is on Starmer. It is on the way he has run this party over the last year, coming up for now, and that is something he has to answer for.
I think it's going to be difficult for him in May anyway, with all of the local elections coming up as well. I mean, it looks like Sadiq will if Labour Party members get on the phone and make the calls and everything, it looks like Sadiq will win almost by default, purely because the other two main candidates are quite so appalling and unsupported by their parties. Well, the Tory one is anyway. But there's surely going to be some strong questions to be answered mid-May, I would imagine, from the leadership of our party. And we don't know what direction it's going to come from.
But the interesting thing as well is he's trying to get his excuses in early with this vaccine bounce, and yet this, at the same time as he's doing that, pretty much we've seen the Tories drop the ball again with the vaccines, so that we're supposedly going to have very limited capacity to do vaccines for at least 4 weeks. The appointments are getting cancelled. People are being told who should have been qualified for the vaccine by April or whatever that they're not going to get it now. And there's quite a lot of uncertainty as to when, the Matt Hancock is being very vague about what's coming and when, which means that he doesn't have a clue really about what's coming and when. And we're going to see, that bounce is less of a factor than Starmer would like us to believe it is. Even before that, we saw them, go from being, we're going to vaccinate everybody. It's going to be, Trump-esque. It's going to be great. And then suddenly it's, but we're going to only give people one shot to begin with now, and it's going to be at least 3 months before they get the next one, even though it's only supposed to be 3 weeks. But that's all fine, and it's going to be great. And people aren't stupid. People know that they are not doing that fantastic a job, and where it's gone well in spite of them, rather than because of them. But of course, when did that ever stop a politician from claiming it as an excuse?
He's put himself in a very difficult position, hasn't he? Because all along this crisis, he said, we agree with the Tories. And we've seen 130,000 plus people die because of the appalling decisions made by the Tories. If we had a leader that was calling them out for that, rather than a vaccine bounce for the Tories, we would be seeing a pandemic bounce for the Labour Party, who are calling this out and actually potentially saving a few thousand lives.
God, yeah. Well, I mean, it's ironic, really. I guess the one place where there has been a vaccine bounce for the Tories has been on the Labour front bench, because they've been all over it, applauded and essentially agreeing how great the Tories are doing, when the gaping holes in the whole thing have just been ignored. And, Starmer turning down open goal after open goal. It's just, it's just this non-opposition, and yet he's shown that he can take, decisive action, but he only seems to be interested in doing that against the left.
Yeah, it's absolutely foul. I mean, the jabs themselves, their availability of these, procuring the jabs, that is on the government. The fantastic part of this, the successful part of this, has actually been delivering those jabs to people, and that's been down to the brilliant work of the NHS, who have done a sterling job in doing that. But they can only do that when they have vaccine to actually administer, and if there's a shortage of that, that is on Matt Hancock. Where is it, Matt? You promised us the earth, you promised us the vaccines. Where are they? Why have we not got them now all of a sudden? I mean, it was bad enough when you delayed it from the recommended 3 weeks from the manufacturers all the way up to 12 weeks for purely bizarre, non-scientific reasons. We're following the science. It's a tune that they keep spinning, but they never, ever seem to be when scientists keep saying, no, we didn't say that. I mean, it's just getting beyond the pale now that the government just seems to be able to get away with whatever it wants to do. It can keep saying we're following the science. The scientists can keep saying no, we aren't, and Labour will continue to sit on its hands and not hold their feet to the fire and say, look, you've said this, you've done something else. Why? I mean, it's a fairly basic way of challenging this. You can make them, twist themselves up in knots by just simply asking, where is it? Why have you not done this? The scientist said this. Why have you done that? I mean, it really is it would be child's play to take this government apart for the way they have run this. It is a conscious choice of the current Labour front bench that they have not done so.
I think as well, what we're beginning to hear is a narrative of these, the availability of these vaccine shots down to other countries holding back reserves and not sending them to us. Now, as far as I'm aware, we have got pharmaceutical capability in this country. It's the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine after all. And it bothers me somewhat that we're relying on vaccines coming from the global south to look after us and denying them from the people in the global south who also need them. Why aren't we manufacturing and producing these vaccines in this country? And why also are we not insisting that the patents for these vaccines are available free of charge to any pharmaceutical company with the capacity to manufacture them?
Well, when you're in a global emergency, you've got no excuse really for not taking emergency measures, really. And yet the Tories will hide behind commercial confidentiality and all the usual nonsense. We're getting towards the end of the session, but we normally like to finish on a positive note if we can scrape one out from somewhere. And this week, fortunately, we've got something good to talk about, which is the clean sweep for the left in the Socialist Health Association elections that took place, and the results were announced yesterday. Essentially, wherever the left stood, they won all the positions. There was, I think, one position that was vacated on the left slate because that candidate had also won the treasurer position. So therefore, she stepped aside in the central council representative bit of that. And that, I think, allowed one centrist to scrape through onto it. But essentially, wherever the left stood, they managed to win. And that was in spite of the non-stop efforts of the right to pack the Socialist Health Association with members supportive of its politics. And, in spite of a constant, I think, there was bad mouthing by the outgoing committee of the left. They blocked a meeting that had been there to discuss the politics of the whole thing and, to let people talk to the left candidates, and they barred that from happening. That's a fantastic result. We also, I think, got a clean sweep in London, excuse me. But, the left has left in a lot of cases. But, there's still enough of us in there to be able to do things when we organise and achieve results. And that, I think, was a big shock to the right.
It's reassuring and it's gratifying when you see that the left still have some clout, isn't it? You think we've been, so many people would, or especially the media, that would love to see the left is dead and buried, and the sensible grown-ups are back in charge again, and all the rest of it. And they ran an appalling campaign on the right. They really tried to stuff these elections with some really quite unsavoury characters, and they played a hideous hand in how they managed their campaigning. And fundamentally, the left just carried on being the left. They just ran their campaign on what they wanted to stand on the correct ethos of not being smearing people and trying to be generally horrible and despicable and all the rest of it, and just carried on in that socialist mentality. And they won through in the end. And I'm delighted for all of them and everybody involved, and especially delighted for the fact that the left is still a powerful entity where it still organizes. And it should be a lesson to the left across the movement, frankly, that we still have power and collectivism, and we need to stay in to keep that.
The other thing that's worth a quick mention is the fact that the Right to Food campaign, which is, that's been a hugely successful campaign with a number of borough and city councils adopting it, Liverpool, Manchester, I think was it Rotherham, Haringey and others. And that group, that campaign has put its submissions into the government's food SAR or whatever is the right term for it this week as well, to put pressure on the Tories to make to make access to adequate food a human right and a legal right that they would then have to uphold. So congratulations to Ian Byrne and the fan supporting food banks people and all the other councils that have supported that and helped to put pressure on. Let's hope that this government organised committee or commission does its job and tells the government that that's what it needs to do if we're going to be a civilised country, which is obviously is an open question at the minute and not a done deal.
It shows the absolute commitment to the general public to actual socialism, looking after people that need a little bit more. And obviously this weekend is Comic Relief. And we will see, again, I suspect, millions of pounds donated to help children who are going without food or proper housing or other actual needs that they have. And it's going to be presented, as per usual, by some multi-millionaire showbiz personalities, but it's the general public's generosity that actually makes this work. Clement Attlee said, charity is a cold, grey, loveless thing. If a rich man wants to help the poor, he should pay his taxes gladly, not dole out money at a whim. Now, that's a fundamental principle, I think. And I'm glad that these celebrities are going to give up an hour or two of their time. But if every single one of them and their ilk were paying their taxes as due, perhaps we wouldn't need so many fundraisers for basic, fundamental human needs.
Well, that seems like a good point to end on for this week's roundup. Thank you, everybody who has watched. Hopefully it's been entertaining for you and informative. And keep watching Socialist Telly. Join us this time next week for the roundup of yet another week of the bizarre merry-go-round that is UK politics at the moment. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you.